My final point is, Paul's right about the reserve capacity at the bottom end, but of course, at the moment at least, we have a totally irrational, politically imposed decision not to use that capacity in the case of recycling until we get to an emergency level. So if we're going to follow this strategy, everyone knows that was a stupid decision, everyone knows it was only done to appease irrational fears. I certainly am much more worried about another flood than I am about drinking water that's been through a recycling plant. And so that I think is something that needs to be scrapped as a first response to the thing. We need to look at those alternative sources in terms of the cost and benefits, not in terms of appeasing silly fears.
And Pat, if we can turn to you just on the specifics of Wivenhoe and the multi-use purpose of Wivenhoe in terms of flood mitigation and capacity for town water and drinking water. Do you actually believe we are in a position with the options on the table and the current infrastructure developments to basically set aside Wivenhoe completely as a flood mitigation device?
You could, but I wouldn't. The reason I say that is Wivenhoe currently has a airspace or attenuation capacity of over 100% of its water storage capacity. So if we abandon the entire water storage and turned it all into airspace, we're going to end up with 220% relative to what we understand full supply level now. As significant as that is, it's nothing compared to the volume of water that comes in a flood. I'd suggest to you we cannot build a dam in this part of the world that could possibly hold all of the water that comes in a flood. I don't know what it was, but the flood that we recently had was a prodigious flood. And so the expectation that it is as simple as sacrificing water volume for airspace behind a dam wall is very simplistic. Because my understanding is that the water that comes from a flood is an order or more bigger than what we're talking about with regard to the dam's capacity. So yes, we could completely abandon it. We could build manufactured water plants and things like that. I don't see that it actually would assist significantly the mitigation of floods in Brisbane. We live in this climate. It's a climate, as you've heard, of both droughts and floods. We have chosen to live in a river valley. We need to be cognizant of that and not try and engineer our way out of something that we accepted as part of our environment.
So with that dose of reality, I now turn to the audience. And our first question from down the back. So there's a microphone just coming behind you. If you could just let us know your name and your organisation.
Thank you very much, Margaret Brown. For my sins, I'm a lawyer, so I know nothing whatsoever about water, but I know a little bit about regulation, and I also grew up in the Brisbane Valley, so I did about anecdotal evidence about the weather. But I haven't heard any mention of Somerset Dam and the interaction between Somerset Dam and Wivenhoe Dam, and whether there was ever any thought about Somerset Dam as a flood mitigation, or was it always water supply? And is there a protocol which governs the interaction between the two dams to address particularly flooding?
Margaret, Somerset Dam flows into Wivenhoe, as you know, so any release from Somerset automatically adds to the level in Wivenhoe. Somerset Dam is actually it's a relatively small dam. I mean, it's not tiny, but it's not a huge dam. It has limit, like any dam, has some flood mitigation component or capacity, as long as it's not at full volume. That Somerset is frankly in a slightly better rain area. In other words, it's likely to get rain more often than Wivenhoe is over a long period of time. But it's got very limited ability, and it has no ability when you get the sort of rainfall that we've recently had in that upper Brisbane, in that upper Brisbane Valley area that all flows directly into Wivenhoe. But it itself has to flow into Wivenhoe, so it was a contributor to the inflows into Wivenhoe in the recent flood. So the answer is I don't think it can play anything except a relatively small role.
becomes very full and has to be released for the same reasons that Wivenhoe had to be released, that is a factor one would have thought that would have to be taken into consideration as to the release from Wivenhoe, because there are times when Somerset has to be released into Wivenhoe.
Yeah, really, you can just think of the Wivenhoe catchment as containing Somerset. I mean, it's in a way very little different from if it wasn't there once it's around 100% full. It's just the catchment for Wivenhoe includes the Somerset is the reality. So they're so inextricably coupled for all intents and purposes.
Here first and then over to David.
Blake Barrett from Queensland Rail. A bit like Andrew, I'm no expert on water, but to save me going and Googling this, I was interested in the aquifers and the groundwater, whether or not it would be possible to fast-track some of this excess water down there in terms of a design. Has that been considered, or is it just completely a crazy idea?
Pat, do you want to take that one?
Crazy idea. It is done in some places in the world. You need to be aware that you can only trap some of the water that's flying past. You'd never build a system that would use all of it. So it will be taking a side stream, so to speak, of the flow that comes past. With regard to can we do it in southeast Queensland, we're not blessed with the most porous aquifers in southeast Queensland, as is, say, Western Australia and things like that. So there could be some practicability with regard to its implementation, but I imagine it would be on the smaller part of the scale and wouldn't have a significant effect with regard to a flood, and probably would have a minor contributing effect with regard to storing water there during normal or good times for drought times.
John, do you know of examples or exemplars elsewhere, either in Australia or around the world, where it's effective?
Western Australia is the primary case. They use aquifer storage extensively there, and but I'll defer to Pat as regards the hydrological feasibility of it. I think it does require specific rock formations, which they have and we don't.
David, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you. I'm David Wyatt. A few weeks ago I was at a community cabinet meeting on the Gold Coast where Anna Bligh walked into a firestorm. People had just got their infrastructure bills and they went berserk at the meeting, and she said she was listening, and she seems to have blinked. But I just wonder, if you step back from it, during the drought we for the first time actually had introduced pricing on water. I don't think that was the thing that changed behaviour. It was the fact that people could see the drought, and there were other reasons. But is there any good evidence that price signals, apart from a shock like what they got here, do work in the Murray-Darling and cities generally?
Absolutely. In irrigated agriculture, if you look at what happened during the drought, agricultural output was maintained to a surprising level despite the severity of the drought, and that reflected transfers of water allocations from relatively low-value uses. Essentially, rice growing, for example, largely stopped during the drought because it simply isn't profitable, to people who really desperately needed the water, horticultural producers. So there's more complexities to it than that, but certainly where water is an input to a productive process, an important input, it's a cost, and businesses economise on that cost. There's a pretty large literature on household responses, and you find pretty much what you'd expect. There is a response, but with something like water, people aren't hugely responsive, and the responses take a fair while to flow through.